The door wasn't supposed to exist. It was hidden behind a rusted metal shelf, buried deep in the basement of a government building long abandoned and forgotten. No records mentioned it, no blueprints acknowledged it, yet there it stood, slightly open, as if someone had just walked through and never returned. The air inside was colder, heavier, wrong. Dust coated everything like a second skin, untouched for decades. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into darkness, each one labeled with faded ink and symbols that didn't quite make sense. It felt less like a storage room and more like a graveyard of secrets, things that were never meant to be remembered. Then came the file. It was sealed differently from the rest. Thick black tape wrapped around its edges, stamped over and over again with the same word, classified. Not once, not twice, dozens of times, as if whoever sealed it wanted to make absolutely sure no one would ever dare open it. But someone did. Inside were photographs. Old. Fragile. Disturbing. They showed people, men, women, even children, standing in places that no longer existed, staring directly into the camera with expressions that felt unnatural. Their eyes didn't just look at the lens. They looked through it. Worse still, none of them had names. No records. No birth certificates. No trace of their existence anywhere outside these pages. As the pages turned, a pattern began to form. Dates repeating. Locations overlapping. Entire groups of people vanishing without explanation only to reappear in these photographs, frozen in time, like echoes of something that refused to stay buried. And then, at the very bottom of the file, there was a note. Handwritten. Rushed. Desperate. This was never supposed to be found. The lights flickered. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the shelves, something moved. The building had been abandoned for decades, its name erased from official records as if it had never served a purpose at all. Locals avoided it, not out of superstition, but because no one could quite explain why it was still standing when everything around it had been demolished and rebuilt. Its windows were blackened, its walls stained with time, and its entrance sealed behind rusted chains that had long since snapped under their own decay. Yet somehow, the structure remained untouched, like something preserved by intention rather than neglect. The discovery began as an accident. A routine inspection crew, sent to evaluate the land for redevelopment, noticed irregularities in the building's foundation, hollow spaces where there shouldn't have been any. The blueprints they had been given showed nothing unusual, no basement levels, no extensions beneath the ground. But the instruments told a different story, revealing a vast, concealed area hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel. It took hours to break through. When they finally did, the opening revealed a narrow passage descending into darkness, the air rising from below cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. The temperature dropped noticeably the deeper they went, as though the underground space had been sealed away from time itself. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, swallowed too quickly by the silence. At the bottom, they found a door. It wasn't marked on any plan, nor did it resemble anything standard. Heavy, reinforced, and completely out of place, it stood as a barrier between what was known and what had been deliberately hidden. There were no labels, no warnings, only deep scratches along its surface, as if something had once tried to claw its way out from the other side. The file wasn't easy to find. It wasn't sitting out in the open like the others, neatly arranged in rusted cabinets waiting to be catalogued. This one had been hidden, deliberately. Behind a row of empty drawers, there was a false panel, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for it. The historian almost missed it, brushing past the cabinet twice before something felt off. The alignment wasn't right. One edge sat just slightly deeper than the rest, like it had been pushed back in a hurry. When the panel finally gave way, it revealed a narrow compartment, just large enough to hold a single object. The file. It was thicker than expected, wrapped tightly in layers of aging material that had begun to crack with time. The surface was covered in stamps, overlapping each other in chaotic repetition, ***, restricted ***, sealed ***, do not access ***, each one darker than the last, as if the warnings had been reinforced again and again over the years. No department name. No classification code. Just urgency. Even before touching it, There was a strange weight to it, something beyond its physical form. The air around it felt different, colder, almost resistant, as if the room itself didn't want the file to be disturbed. For a moment, hesitation crept in. Not fear exactly, but something deeper, something instinctive. Still, curiosity won. As the seal was broken, the sound echoed unnaturally loud in the silent room, like something irreversible had just been set into motion. The first page inside wasn't a report, or a summary, or anything that resembled official documentation. It was a warning. Typed unevenly, the ink slightly faded but still legible, as if preserved with intention. If you are reading this, you were not meant to. The first few pages made no sense. They weren't structured like official reports, nor did they follow any recognizable format. Dates appeared without context, locations were written in fragments, and entire sections had been blacked out so aggressively that the paper itself had nearly torn. It felt less like documentation and more like something that had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving behind only what couldn't be completely erased. But patterns began to emerge. Certain words repeated: incident, containment, subjects. They appeared across multiple pages, sometimes in different handwriting, sometimes typed, sometimes scratched hastily into the margins as if added later by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever this was, it hadn't been recorded once. It had been revisited, updated, altered, and then hidden. One page stood out. Unlike the others, it was mostly intact. At the top was a date decades old, and beneath it, a brief description that had somehow escaped redaction. It referenced a location that no longer existed on any modern map, followed by a single line that sent a quiet chill through the room. Initial exposure confirmed. Civilian awareness unacceptable. There was no explanation of what exposure meant. No details about what had been seen, or by whom. Just that it had happened, and that it wasn't supposed to. Further in, the documents became more fragmented, but the tone shifted. The language grew urgent, almost panicked. Mentions of removal, relocation, and memory suppression appeared more frequently, alongside lists of numbers that might have once been names. Entire groups referenced only as quantities, as if identities had been stripped away entirely. And then came the realization. This wasn't just a report about something that had happened. It was evidence of something that had been erased. Not forgotten. Erased on purpose. The photographs were buried deeper in the file, pressed between layers of reports as if someone had tried to hide them even within the hidden. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, faded black and white prints, edges curled with age, surfaces scratched and worn. But the longer they were studied, the more something about them began to feel wrong. Each image captured groups of people standing together, posed stiffly as if instructed not to move. Their clothing matched no specific era, a strange blend of styles that shouldn't have existed at the same time. Some wore garments decades apart in fashion, yet stood side by side without question. It created a quiet sense of distortion, like time itself had been folded unevenly. Their faces were worse. None of them smiled. None of them showed any natural expression at all. They stared directly into the camera with blank, almost hollow eyes, as if they were aware of something the viewer wasn't. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was absence. Like whatever made them human had been stripped away, leaving behind only a surface. There were no names attached. No dates printed on the back. No location markers. Just numbers, small, faint markings in the corners, as though they had been catalogued as objects rather than people. One photograph, in particular, refused to be ignored. It showed a group standing in front of a structure that didn't exist anymore, at least, not in any current record. The building behind them was unmistakable in its design, yet searching through known archives brought up nothing. It had no history, no documentation, no trace beyond this single image. And then there was the detail that made everything colder. In the background, partially obscured by shadow, there was an extra figure. Blurred. Indistinct. Not standing with the others, but watching them. At first, the symbols seemed like nothing more than random markings, ink smudges, printing errors, or perhaps coded references lost to time. The entire groups of people vanished from public life, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in clusters. Birth certificates, census entries, even newspaper mentions were gone without explanation. Yet in these hidden documents, they were meticulously recorded: dates of disappearance, locations last seen, strange notes in the margins hinting at circumstances that had been carefully erased. It was as if someone or something had been systematically removing them from history while simultaneously preserving proof only in secret. The locations themselves were disturbing. Forests that had been cleared decades ago, towns that had been absorbed into modern developments, rivers rerouted or buried, places that no longer existed but were central to the story the historian was piecing together. Each disappearance was tied to a site that, in public memory, had been wiped away, leaving no trace except in these buried records. It wasn't just individuals who were affected. Entire families appeared to vanish simultaneously, leaving behind nothing but the faintest bureaucratic trace that was quickly expunged. The repetition became eerie, almost ritualistic. Numbers aligned too perfectly, dates too neatly sequenced, as though someone had been following a deliberate pattern rather than chaos. And then it hit, the historian realized that the pattern wasn't just in the records. It was ongoing. Even in files from recent decades, the same markers appeared. Whatever had orchestrated the disappearances in the past hadn't stopped. It had merely gone deeper underground, continuing its work silently, invisibly, beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge. The historian first noticed it in subtle ways, small inconsistencies that might have gone unnoticed by anyone less careful. Doors that had been closed when they were certain they had left them open, files slightly shifted from where they had placed them, the faint creak of a floorboard that should have remained silent. At first, they tried to dismiss it as imagination or the building settling over decades, but the feeling of being watched persisted, growing heavier with each passing hour. It wasn't just the physical space that seemed alive, the documents themselves carried a sense of scrutiny. Certain pages appeared to have been handled after the historian opened them, corners bent in ways they hadn't been before, markings that weren't there yesterday suddenly visible, almost as if warning or guiding them. The pattern of disappearances, the cryptic symbols, the erased identities, all of it felt alive under someone's unseen gaze, monitored, catalogued, and controlled from somewhere beyond reach. Emails, notes, and messages that should have remained private began appearing in the mind as hypothetical scenarios, almost like warnings encoded into their consciousness. The historian realized with an unsettling clarity that whoever had orchestrated this concealment was still paying attention. It wasn't merely the past that was hidden, it was actively guarded, defended against anyone who might stumble too close to the truth. Even the air seemed charged, thick with anticipation, as though the very act of discovery had triggered a silent response. Shadows shifted unnaturally, passages that had seemed empty minutes ago now felt crowded with intention. Every sound, the rustle of paper, the distant hum of the building, the faint scratching of unseen things, took on a deliberate quality, a message delivered through movement and absence. The historian understood then that the secrets they had uncovered were not merely forgotten, they were defended. Someone or something was ensuring that nothing, no matter how carefully unearthed, could ever fully escape the darkness that had claimed it. The first recording was discovered tucked away in a drawer behind layers of old, yellowed files, labeled only with a single word, **** audio, do not play. ***, the tape itself was brittle, the reel inside slightly warped, but curiosity outweighed caution. As soon as the player whirred to life, a low static hiss filled the room, thick and suffocating, like a fog pressing against the ears. Then came the voices. They weren't speaking clearly. Distorted, overlapping, sometimes speeding up or slowing down unnaturally, they sounded almost human, but not entirely. Words could be discerned only in fragments, cries of alarm, hurried whispers, and the repeated murmuring of a single phrase that seemed to echo endlessly, ***, it must remain hidden. ***, the historian felt a chill crawl up their spine, realizing that the fear in the voices was not acted, it was real, or at least, it had been real once. Between the human sounds, there were other noises. Metallic clinks, the scraping of something being dragged across concrete, faint thuds that might have been footsteps, and an occasional low hum that vibrated through the floor as if coming from some machine or creature just beyond perception. Every few minutes, The tape would warp the sound, stretching the voices into wails or warbling them into ghostly tones that seemed almost intelligent, as if trying to communicate something beyond language. Listening became addictive despite the dread. Each second seemed to pull the historian deeper into the room, into the past, into a place where time itself had been manipulated. There was a rhythm to it, a sequence of tones and silences that matched the pattern of disappearances in the files. It was almost as though the recordings weren't just capturing sound, they were recording something alive, something aware of being uncovered. By the time the tape ended, the historian realized the worst. These weren't merely recordings of events. They were warnings. And whatever had been captured on them was still listening. The deeper the historian dug, the clearer it became that the truth had never been left to chance. Every document, photograph, and recording pointed to deliberate concealment. Names were erased, incidents rewritten, official reports altered to mislead, and yet, in the margins of these altered records, faint traces of reality persisted. Whoever had orchestrated this had done so with meticulous care, understanding not just how to hide facts, but how to manipulate memory itself, leaving the public with a version of history that was sanitized, incomplete, and utterly convincing. It wasn't just government bureaucracy at play, it felt intentional on a much larger, almost personal scale. Files had been marked, reordered, and sometimes destroyed, but always carefully enough that the destruction itself became part of the cover story. In some cases, entire archives had been relocated, buried in secret vaults or hidden behind false walls, ensuring that only those in the know could ever access the truth. The historian realized that each disappearance, each redaction, each subtle alteration of the record had been done with foresight, as though anticipating the curiosity of anyone who might stumble upon it decades later. Even more disturbing were the gaps that could not be explained by paperwork alone. Entire towns, neighborhoods, and families had been erased from maps, their existence denied in every official register. The connections between these erasures and the files were undeniable. Patterns emerged, and it became chillingly apparent that the concealment was ongoing, a living process that adapted over time to ensure nothing could fully surface. It wasn't a relic of the past, it was a mechanism still in motion. The historian's realization was slow, creeping like ice through veins. The world they thought they knew, the history that had been taught and recorded, was only a carefully constructed illusion. The truth had been buried not by accident, but by design, and it had been watched over, protected, and manipulated to remain hidden for as long as anyone dared to seek it. The final piece of evidence wasn't tucked away in some forgotten drawer or hidden behind false panels. It was staring the historian in the face, subtle and unassuming, almost ordinary if not for the weight of what it implied. A small, leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and worn, had been slipped between two stacks of files as if placed there deliberately, waiting for discovery. Unlike the other documents, it bore no warning stamps, no redactions, no cryptic symbols, only a single line etched into the leather. Asterisk asterisk, read carefully, and do not underestimate what watches. Asterisk asterisk. As the historian opened it, the pages revealed a level of detail that was staggering. Names, dates, events, all meticulously catalogued, but what truly made it horrifying was the context. Every disappearance, every erasure, every manipulated record from the decades prior was connected in ways that were impossible to ignore. The notebook even referenced recent occurrences, events that were still unfolding, places and people that had not yet been touched in official histories. Whoever had compiled this had been tracking the world with obsessive precision, maintaining a record that bridged past, present, and the near future, and they had anticipated the possibility of discovery long before the historian arrived. It became immediately clear that this was no ordinary archive. The notebook contained maps, diagrams, even cryptic annotations suggesting that the orchestrator of these secrets was still active, still observing, still deciding who remained in the light and who was erased. Every detail seemed to pulse with intent, like a blueprint of a system that had never ceased to operate. And then the realization hit. The historian understood that the file, the recordings, the photographs, and the symbols were not merely remnants of history. They were part of an ongoing process, a machine designed to manipulate, erase, and control reality itself. Holding the notebook, the historian felt the oppressive weight of what had been uncovered. The secret had not been buried in the past. It was alive, and in reaching this final piece of evidence, they may have already walked too close to a force that would not tolerate discovery.